Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's show. My name is Spencer Wells. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We got a good one for you, a great one for you, I should say. As always, here is what we are working with. Number one, the DOJ has released what is a pretty scathing report. And it is all about George Floyd in Minneapolis, and specifically the Minneapolis Police Department, their response to everything with regards to George Floyd and the systemic abuses that made it possible. We'll tell you all of the most drastic findings. There are some pretty drastic findings in there as our first story in the show, and some of the recommendations that have been made, as well as some of the fallout. Meanwhile, Matt Bruning, the premier policy wonk of the left, is making a pretty interesting point about student debt and saying why we really shouldn't worry if it gets struck down in the Supreme Court, because there are other alternative options. Also, some pretty big breaking news. We'll actually do this story before the Supreme Court story. The UPS union workers, the Teamsters, have approved the right to strike. They have authorized a strike if no deal is reached, as contract negotiations are continuing apace. That's as of August 1st. They'll have just to kind of cap off the summer. And a pretty cool story out of Austria, where in a last-minute change, the Austrian quote-unquote Bernie Sanders was elected party leader of the big liberal party there. We'll get into all of that. So pretty big, pretty amazing stuff. A lot of interesting stuff to get to on the show today. So we're going to get right into it at the top with the DOJ. They have been investigating the Minneapolis Police Department for quite some time now. Apparently now the DOJ is politicized, so it doesn't matter. No, I'm just kidding. There's going to be, it's a huge kind of fallout from this, as it is one of their biggest duties is to hold these kind of police departments accountable, and especially if they are violating the civil rights, especially of minorities in their jurisdiction. This is the breakdown. The federal investigations obviously launched in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer, finding that systemic problems in the MPD made what happened to George Floyd possible. So this is from the New York Times. We're going to kind of go through this bullet point by bullet point. So the Justice Department found reasonable cause to believe that police officers engaged in a pattern or practice of conduct that deprives people of their rights under the Constitution and federal law. Investigators accused Minneapolis police of engaging in unlawful discrimination against Black and Native American people, and said the police force patrols differently based on the racial composition of the neighborhood without a legitimate related safety rationale. So again, these kind of claims that, all the crime is happening here, all the crime is happening in these Black neighborhoods, so that's why we have to patrol extra aggressively and come in with an extra aggressive mindset. That is the Justice Department has kind of found with something that we have been, on the left have been saying for quite a long time. There is no reason to have that extra kind of stop and frisk, broken window style policing rationale when you're going into those neighborhoods. There is no rational security, safety related concern. That is a BS argument. Is it going to be the end of this argument? Obviously, no way. But it does. It is clear that this is going to be a pretty big win for some of the people, the police reformist to abolitionist swath of the spectrum, and to say that some of this broken windows policing and these where you go extra hard in these specific neighborhoods, it is kind of ridiculous, and it's just not backed up by anything rational. So among 19 police shootings, amid January 2016 and August of 2022, federal investigators found that a significant portion of them were unconstitutional uses of deadly force, with officers sometimes shooting without first determining whether there was an immediate threat of harm to the officer or others. No word on how significant that portion is, but pretty important to take a look at. Derek Chauvin, the officer convicted of the murder in Floyd's death, had used excessive force previously. In those other cases, investigators found multiple other MPD officers stood by and did not stop him. Justice Department said the city violates the Americans with Disabilities Act by discriminating against people with behavioral health disabilities, which is so interesting that this was actually brought up, because I think it is very, very critical when it comes to, kind of accurately portraying the full swath of ways that police can harm people. We've seen black people with mental health problems, and there was, I think, an upstate New York case. I think I may be completely wrong, but I believe the man's name was Daniel Prude, who was having a mental health episode and was kind of choked out by police in a very similar style to, not specifically with the knee, but in terms of the asphyxiation and all that. Just because that person was, having a mental health crisis, and it can make it all the more easy for police officers to use deadly force and to make themselves work themselves up into, feeling like it's a threat. And again, it's not really the fault of the individual police officer. It's a hive mind type of system. When you're in there with people, you're psyching yourselves up all day long. Everything's a threat. When you have, so classic, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail type situation. You see all this type of, all these kind of, very, very weak people, just fundamentally in terms of the power that they have in society. Even, they may have some mental disabilities. They may be, minorities. They may be poor, and any certain, those people, as we saw in the earlier clip, they live in the bad neighborhood. So what happens then is you have people who go in there, police officers who go in there with, a little bit of extra fear, maybe a lot of extra fear, and a lot of dehumanization and demonization. We've seen countless examples of just police chats leaking of incredibly disparaging comments about the communities that they serve. And that is all part and parcel of the mindset and the just general culture that is there, and that these people take into doing their jobs. And that is a pretty big part, it seems, of this report. So they say, quote, in this report, many behavioral health related calls for service do not require a police response. So yeah, there's Biden essentially endorsing defund the police. But anyway, the MPD responds to a majority of those calls, and that response is often harmful and ineffective. I think, that to me is about where I stand on defund the police. I personally, I would love a world where there's no police or, no prison or anything like that, but I just don't see a viable way of how we can get there. But it is unquestionable. The police, similar to the military, like in cities especially, have such an outsized role. Everything is kind of passed off and worked through them, in terms of police officers, in terms of, responding to every single call, whether writing tickets, whether they're breaking up, kind of domestic abuse situations, whether they're, just put in every single possible situation and given all the money, which is, no doubt used incredibly wastefully, is really just just to be a not just for the society, but for the police officers as well. It's seen to be, it's proven. I feel like we have enough. We have a body of evidence big enough to say that this is an incredibly detrimental practice for sure. Federal investigators often routinely fail to take arrestees' health complaints seriously, saying we found numerous incidents in which officers responded to a person's statement that they could not breathe with a version of, "You can breathe, you're talking right now." So that is something that they probably were told to say. Part of the, go back into the break room and be like, of course they say that they can't breathe, but they're talking. Ha! I told you, like that is like a probably a classic joke that's been shared, but then too many of those people, at least according to this report, have actually then stopped breathing and not started again. And then here's the broader culture problem. Investigators describe instances of racist conduct by Minneapolis police officers and degrading comments about black people. Some officers we spoke with aired fears and grievances about being perceived racist, even as they made comments to us that suggest bias and contempt for the people they're supposed to serve. which is very interesting. We'd love to hear more about what those comments are. And then, that speaks to this mindset, this siege mindset, this siege mentality of we are constantly under attack, and the people we're most under attack from are those people in those bad neighborhoods, right? So we got to be extra kind of serious about them. They have no life, they have no future. They're just do crimes all day long and make our lives miserable. And they're the reason we may not get home to our families at the end of the day. All that kind of stuff. I can only imagine some of the stuff, and I haven't even read the report, so I can only imagine some of the stuff that's probably actually in there, and definitely some of the stuff that didn't make the report. I'm sure. After Floyd's murder, investigators said Minneapolis officers suddenly stopped reporting race and gender in a large number of stops despite a department requirement to collect that information. About 71% of traffic stops before Floyd's death had race data, compared with about 35% after. And that kind of, again, speaks to a huge problem, which is in all of these major cities. Police have effectively stopped doing their jobs and let crime kind of spring up all around them. I can hear people saying, oh, well, doesn't that show that you need the police? Well, I think the big thing is people who want, any reform to the police, they don't want it to happen overnight, and they don't want it to happen without a plan. You don't want police intentionally not doing their jobs to spite the people of the community, which is clearly what's going on there. Like, that's just a small example of it. It's just a kind of covering your own ass type situation. But we've seen other kind of countless examples. Like time and time again, like countless examples we've seen, in the wake of this in Minneapolis, we've seen, in the wake of this George Floyd report coming out, and in cities all across, and this has been going on since Ferguson, a police coming down systematically and saying, we don't want to do our jobs because we are, I guess, too afraid of getting called out. And it really just shows you any little, prick that they can take against the system, any sort of, basic resistance to them having absolute power over every aspect of the society is absolutely unacceptable to them. And that's just why they probably have to be some of the biggest, babies ever in public life. But again, any sort of resistance, any sort of pushback to the system is of them being absolutely on top, unacceptable, unconscionable, and an attack in which they have to stop working at a moment's notice, and literally like what we see happen in San Francisco, let people's cars get broken into, just let all sorts of chaos kind of reign because they are too pig-headed, too stubborn, too power-hungry to even begin to think about accepting reform. Let's see here. What else is next? The report also said officers routinely violated the First Amendment rights of demonstrators and journalists at protests. When some people at demonstrations break the law, the report said that MPD officers frequently used indiscriminate force, failing to distinguish between peaceful protesters and those committing crimes. And we saw early on, from literally the days after Floyd was murdered, some of the protests, some of those aggressive actions, some of those instigatory action was taken not by the protesters but by the police officers. They've been pushing back. They've been kettling people, which is one of the popular terms of 2020, where they would just be kind of cordoned off into one area, really compressed, and just kind of aggressively pushed back by essentially stormtroopers, these riot police. The report found that investigations of officer misconduct, even serious misconduct, have been inexcusably slow. More than 53% of cases remain unsolved for at least 1 year, and more than 26% remain unsolved for at least 2 years. Officers under investigation for serious misconduct were sometimes assigned to train new recruits, the report found. Some field training officers, they found, violated a person's rights while training a new officer. Again, it's all part of the culture. It's, if you don't rip it out from root and stem, it's been allowed to fester for too long. Just a culture of, it is part of what happens when you give cops so much power in society. Again, it's not saying we have to, completely, I don't see a way where we completely abolish the police department, remove all sort of policing and imprisoning capabilities, but there is no way, we have to severely limit the power that cops have, even in the most serious situations. We need to, for really only the most serious situations, and we need to absolutely, completely just reconsider the force, the responsibilities police are allowed to have, the force they're allowed to use, the capabilities. Police, even in the UK, like a lot of Americans like consider the UK probably the most, kind of very comparable country. In Canada, no police have guns even. Like, it is that much of a difference where even they've really done some pretty awful things the Met has in England, but they have way less power. They have way less gun, just firepower and influence in society and budget and, your responsibilities that they're allowed to, abuse essentially. In that, I really think has probably been, it was just one of the biggest problems. The process, again, for residents to file complaints against officers is deeply flawed. So it's, again, essentially complaining to the fox, your hen complaining to the fox about why all the chickens are going missing. Like, it's essentially, it's essentially ridiculous. It's pointless, essentially. So there are some recommendations. A few of the recommendations in this New York Times report are minimize the use of force by revising and improving policies that require officers to de-escalate and consider less intrusive alternatives before employing force. Again, I don't know. This sounds good, but I don't know how much you can tell, de-escalate, don't use force, just chill out to people who have been doing it for their entire careers and don't want to do it. And there's no kind of teeth to really bite them, frankly, if they're not able to do it. Like, if they fail. Improve data collection to identify problematic trends and develop policies, training, and recommendation to reduce the use of force. Develop new policies suited for interactions with young people and individuals with behavioral health needs. And improve documentation and data collection of police activity. Improve police trainings related to protests and demonstrations to protect First Amendment freedoms. Again, I feel like they already know this stuff. It's not like, oh, I'm unaware that a journalist is allowed to film me doing something bad at a protest. It's that I don't want a journalist to film me doing something bad at a protest, and I'm going to use my baton on their camera to stop them because I know I will be allowed to get away with it. And for the most part, they're right. And until they're wrong, that is the problem. Again, some of this the teeth behind this stuff, I would say, is probably one of the biggest ones. So, just again, before we go on our next story, here's some examples that they cited. So MPD officers arrested a woman whom they knew from prior contacts and transported her to jail. On the way, the woman said she was a type 1 diabetic and she could not see straight. She asked to see a doctor twice. The officers did not call for one. When they arrived at the jail over 10 minutes later, they handcuffed a woman who was limp in the squad car. As she lay on the pavement, she moaned, "I need help." She once again told the officers she was diabetic. And she said, this is really awful. So she was on the floor, just in pain, couldn't see straight, all that kind of stuff. In response, an officer bent over and said, "Just so we're clear, since you're playing games, I'm going to add another charge for obstruction, okay? So you're going to spend more time in the clink, okay?" As a nurse from the jail approached the woman to examine her, the officer and his partner repeatedly undermined the woman's claims that she needed assistance, claiming, "Oh, she does that every time." One of the MPD officers also told the nurse that he didn't know if the woman was a diabetic, but joked, quote, "She's got tons of needles, I know that." Again, so this is perfectly like one of the comments I'm talking about. Oh, they're all junkies, they have no future. In fact, poor people are probably among the most likely to be diabetic. Like, it's not. They're kind of symptom. Not to say like it's very, who knows if this woman was, a junkie or not, but it's very, very, very likely. And again, just shows a complete contempt for and hatred of people that they serve to say, oh, this woman, who knows if she was or wasn't, but she's definitely a freaking junkie. Screw her. After the nurse gave a brief examination, the woman laid back on the concrete, barely moving. The officers then used a wrap, a full-body restraint, typically used to control combative people, to carry the woman to jail. Again, this is someone who was limp. And it does not say further here what even happened to her, which is really ridiculous. In 2014, an MPD officer responded to a report that a man had committed retail theft. The OPCR investigator noted the store surveillance video showed the officer punching the man multiple times in the face with a closed fist while the man is handcuffed behind his back. The force review supervisor completed the force review without viewing the surveillance footage that would have revealed the misconduct, and the MPD did not investigate further at the time. So people, again, you're allowed to completely get away. And until there's real punishment for people, I'm talking about arresting these officers who do this kind of stuff, that's the only way it's going to stop. or you take some of the power, some of the resources away from these people to completely just get away with it and take them out of situations where they could do this and put them, at the desk and maybe lay some of them off. Like, you need drastic action here, because these are people who are just frankly not going to relent. All right, we'll go down to our next story. But first, a little announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening and supporting Newsflash. We now have a brand new way for you to be heard if you want, whether a text message or a audio message. Please, no video messages. I really just do not think that's necessary. We have a new feedback box open for you. Ladies and gentlemen, it is officially open. SWRN702@gmail.com. Send a text message, send a voice message of no more than 30 seconds via the voice memos function. Either of those two options, and we will 100%, not going to find this guarantee anywhere else. We're going to play it on the show, listen to what you have to say, and it literally could be about anything. Well, if it's inappropriate, we won't play it, but it could be about anything. Thank you so much. This is my thank you to all the listeners who have stuck out with us and want to have their own voice in the show. SWRN702@gmail.com is the address. SWRN702 is that number. It's Friday, though, so you know what that means. Hidden History is back. Just a quick little plug here for Hidden History. Pretty excited to have that one back for sure. We are talking about South Korea today and the Korean War and how that war really shaped the country. Now, we're taking a look at both sides, some of the relatively underreported action they did, especially on the South Korean side, in terms of really making an incredibly intense political climate, and how that affects both sides of the peninsula to this day. Very, very interesting stuff there for sure. All right. So we now are going to move on here. And we are talking a little bit about labor, which is pretty cool. Always love to do that. In the UPS strike, the Teamsters specifically, they're in negotiations until August 1st, but here in the Washington Post, the reporting is the UPS union workers voted to approve the right to strike just before we started recording this podcast, putting the nation's largest shipping company a step closer to a shutdown that could threaten the transportation of goods and commodities nationwide later this summer. It could, it definitely will. Simple as that. Around 350,000 UPS employees will be affected. And a lot more than that, too, just people all across the country, as they authorize the nationwide strike as of August 1st. The vote does not mean, again, a strike will happen, but it gives the labor leaders the right to call a walkout that could paralyze the economy if the contract deal is not reached in negotiations by the end of July. So it's a very, very interesting situation here, because you got UPS and you got Teamsters, and you've got a really different Teamsters union in terms of leadership composition that we have seen in a long time. For years, obviously, the Teamsters have been run by the Hoffas and the Hoffaites, kind of really doing some pretty corrupt stuff in terms of their contracts, especially with the UPS deal. Last time, it was very kind of infamous in the union world. They negotiated a two-tier contract. This was the one that gave better compensation to people hired after a certain point, putting them on a higher tier than the people that were hired more recently. And that really, really inflamed and enraged a lot of people. That so much so, it was voted down by the members, but it was forced through kind of an arcane procedure. It was forced on the members until their next contract. And then, obviously, after the contract election time came, and it was late last year, Sean O'Brien of the Teamsters, I think it was actually it was close to like 2 years ago or so. Sean O'Brien of the Teamsters came back with the win. That was a pretty big deal. And one of the things he really exclusively ran on was that we are not going to let the UPS push us around this time. We're going to really try and get some really big concessions out of them in terms of improved working conditions. 97% of its members in the UPS union voted to strike. So let's see what we got here. Leading the fight is Teamsters President O'Brien, whose rise to the top job, again, here in the Washington Post, as I just explained, they're right. His rise to the top job ended decades of Hoffa family leadership in 2022. So I was right, it was 2022. He campaigned on a platform to take a more aggressive approach to UPS contract negotiations and organize Amazon, the logistics giant that continues to fight union organizing efforts. If there is going to be a strike at UPS, it's not going to be because of the Teamsters, O'Brien said last week on a call with rank-and-file UPS Teamster members. It's going to be because of the greediness of the company, and they're unwilling to reward people who have made them the success that they are. They said they have reached more than 24 tentative deals on their contract, including landmark agreements to equip UPS package delivery vans, new package delivery vans, beginning next year with air conditioning. Apparently that was a big thing they had to fight for. It was just basic right to, not collapsing of heat stroke. Again, they're having managers following them around in their personal cars, kind of harassing them to make sure that they deliver their packages faster. Again, the air conditioning thing, again, it has caused literally people to have heat stroke as well. It is definitely one of the top issues, one of the sticking points in this contract negotiation, but it does not provide any drivers immediate relief heading into the summer months. Again, the number is 140 UPS employees that have been injured in a heat or dehydration-related incident, according to UPS. They also have agreed to language that prevents UPS from using driverless vehicles or drones without negotiating with the union. The parties also settled on terms that prevent the installation of driver-facing cameras in vehicles and would provide increased UPS penalties for payroll errors. However, for many UPS employees, the issues remaining on the bargaining table are the most important. Starting pay for part-time workers who handle packages in the UPS warehouse is $15.50 an hour, which union members note is similar to current wages in the fast food industry. Roughly half of UPS Teamsters positions are part-time warehouse jobs, saying this is just not a sustainable wage, says Cesar Castro, part-time package handler in LA, who's part of the Teamsters bargaining committee. He says he makes $18.85 an hour after 9 years at UPS, which is a level of pay that, it used to be a middle-class job because, obviously because of the strength of the union. But as the union has atrophied over the years, we've seen, closer ties to the Hoffas and, people like them, kind of really giving a lot of concessions to the UPS bosses. That job has really become essentially, like working at McDonald's, which is really something that it should not be, because it is a union job. McDonald's should be a union job as well, that's for sure. And they should be raising the floor so that more and more people, both of them, although UPS currently is the one that's in the union right now, they should be raising the floor, both of them, so that pay like this is unacceptable. And again, as Bernie Sanders said, nobody, and a lot of other people, but he's the first one that comes to my mind, nobody should work 40 hours a week. And I understand this is a part-time job, but the principle still applies, especially to the full-time people who are working at both those companies. Nobody should work 40 hours a week and not be able to afford to put food on the table. In a statement on its website, UPS says part-time roles are essential to our success. And of course, the union wants more full-time jobs. And they are essential to the success in terms of making billions of dollars of profit for like their private equity owners like BlackRock and Vanguard and all that, State Street and all that. But they're not essential to the ability of the large majority of UPS workers to continue to put food on the table. But they provide union members with industry-leading benefits, as what they say. But not you can bet the part-time people, and again, this is another reason why they call part-time workers essential to UPS success, is because they don't have to give them as good benefits. Again, the 2018 contract negotiations, that was the last one where the two-tier system was put in place, and that is something that they're fighting to get rid of. Teamster leadership says the two jobs are essentially the same, and they want to eliminate this new driver classification. That would be a big win for the Teamsters. After they just agreed for that in 2018, they'd be able to claw that right back through the power of organized collective action. UPS had said the position were introduced in the agreement with the Teamsters to provide the company with more flexibility to meet consumer demand to deliver packages on Saturdays. In ongoing contract talks, the UPS has declared its commitment to finding a better model that addresses employee needs while retaining the flexibility to meet our customers' delivery weekend needs, the company said in a statement. So that is going to be very, very interesting. I believe August 1st is the D-Day where it's going to be decided about what happens from here. All right, on to our next story, as we are going to have a little bit of a long one here today, but please stick with us. We got Supreme Court analyzed by Matt Bruning coming up right now, and then a cool story about Austria's Bernie Sanders to end things off. In August of last year, Joe Biden announced that he would be forgiving $10,000 worth of student debt for individuals with income below a certain level. Matt Bruning writes, the Biden administration claimed that a post-9/11 statute called the HEROES Act gave him this authority because it allows the president to modify student loans in response to a national emergency. He announced the policy after he did. Various individuals, organizations, and governments filed lawsuits to try and have the program halted. One of those suits made it to the Supreme Court, and the court may decide it on it soon. And many say that they're likely to conclude that's going to be unconstitutional. A state-affiliated debt servicer in Missouri called Mohella has also been saying to sue. But if the Supreme Court decides to rule against Biden, it will obviously be a major blow to the cause of student debt forgiveness. But there is also a straightforward legal path for Biden to unilaterally forgive a lot of the student debt that does not rely upon expansive interpretations of a post-9/11 statute. In the Higher Education Act, Congress has not just authorized but directly mandated the Department of Education to create income-driven repayment programs for student loans. One of those programs, called the Income-Based Repayment, or the IBR, has its parameters specifically spelled out in Statute 20. This is classic Matt Bruning nerdery here. 20 U.S.C. 1098E. The other program, called Income Contingent Repayment, or ICR, is just a general grant authority to the DOJ to create these income-driven repayment programs with the parameters of choosing, within the parameters of its choosing. So they can essentially create programs, long and short, TLDR. Department of Education can create programs to, stratify payments, change how you repay your payment based on your income. So the DOE has already created 3 IDR programs, that's income-based repayment programs under this authority, Income Contingent Repayment Authority. One called the Income Contingent Repayment, another called Pay As You Earn, and a third called Revised Pay As You Earn. Under these IDR programs, students must pay a certain percent of their income beyond a certain percent of the poverty line for a certain number of years in order to receive debt forgiveness. So these 3 parameters vary between the 3 programs and can be set pretty much wherever the DOE chooses to set them. The HEA, though, contains some pretty big some limits on how stingy they can be, but not on how generous they can be. When Biden announced his student debt forgiveness plan, he also announced a new ICR-based proposed rulemaking that got much less attention. Under the proposal, the revised income contingent repayment program would be amended so that instead of forgiveness being provided to students after they paid either 10% of their income, 2 beyond 150% of the poverty line, 3 for 20 years, they would be instead provided forgiveness if they paid 5% of their income beyond 225% of the poverty line for 10 years if their original student loan balance was below $12,000, or 20 years if their student loan balance exceeded $12,000. In the long run, this change, if administered well, will actually forgive far more student debt than the $10,000 forgiveness that has gotten all the attention and the legal challenges. So that could kind of slip under the radar, and based on these kind of pretty expansive limits in this new change of this, income-based repayment program, that could really get a lot more people than just canceling the first 10,000. But the authority that allows Biden to make this change through regulation will also allow him to go much further. On its face, there's no reason why Biden could not use this authority under the HEA to create a new income-based repayment program that states, for example, that students will be eligible for debt forgiveness if they had paid 1% of their income beyond 100% of the poverty line for 1 year. this kind of change would forgive far more student debt than the change that is currently facing legal challenge. So, again, so there's a very, very interesting point, as always, there by Matt Bruning. It's going to be very, very interesting to see if this kind of picks up any kind of traction. And it'll be a great way to do it, around Congress and kind of get past some of the people, who will never, ever, 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 ever want to see student debt forgiven in any way. And just be kind of jihad-like opposed to it. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on. All right, we wrap up with Austria's Bernie Sanders, believe it or not, next.
It's the Center Wall Radio Network.
Oh, see. Going to park in the latest drop. Got stopped by a lady cop. She got me thinking I could date a cop. Cause her uniform pants so tight. She read me well right. She put me in a call. She cut up all the lights. She said I have the right to remain silent. Now I gotta holler. Sounding like a siren.
All right. We are now moving into our last story. This is again in Jacobin by Adam Baltner. Andreas Babler's bid to become chairman of Austria's Social Democratic Party, or the SPO, appeared to be a familiar story of initial promise and inevitable disappointment. For 10 weeks, left-wingers' impassioned insurgent campaign had surely kindled enthusiasm on the left. Yet at the party congress on Saturday, June 3rd in Linz, it looked as though it wasn't enough. Once the slightly more than 600 delegates had cast their ballots, it was announced that Babler had earned 47% of the vote, falling just short of the ultimate prize. His opponent, Hans-Peter Doskozel, was the face of the party's right wing. He was declared the winner. Then, a bombshell. Shortly after the results were published, public TV anchorman Martin Thür pointed out on Twitter that the sum of the valid and invalid votes did not match the total number of ballots cast. On the Monday afternoon, SPO Electoral Commission Director Michaela Grubesa announced that a recount had uncovered a far more egregious error. The vote totals of the candidates had been switched while being entered into an Excel spreadsheet. The following day, Grubesa, a member of the Styrian State Parliament and domestic partner of Max Lurcher, the campaign manager of Babler's opposition, Doskozel, announced her resignation as the head of the Electoral Commission. The votes were then counted for a third time. Finally, the official confirmation arrived. Babler, in fact, received 53% of the vote and was elected chairman of his party. And good thing she was hot. Just damn, that's pretty embarrassing. The story may sound incredible, but it was less unbelievable than the fact that a politician with Babler's profile now stands at the helm of the SPO. He's a 50-year-old mayor of a town called Traiskirchen, the Vienna suburb with a population of just under 19,000. Babler can be regarded as the Austrian Bernie Sanders of Jeremy Corbyn. A former secretary of Austria's Socialist Youth and vice president of the International Union of Socialist Youth, Babler was socialized as a Marxist in his late teens and early 20s. Yet, unlike many social democratic leaders today who were once radicals before distancing themselves from their past, Babler has remained faithful to his ideological commitments. At least since the 1990s, SPO has pursued a pretty neoliberal course that offers no perspective for fundamental social transformation. But Babler still describes himself as a socialist and even refers on occasion to Marxism, which he described in a recent television appearance as a good lens through which to view the world. In speeches and interviews, he also emphasized the SPO's own rich history as a workers' party and his own biography as the child of a working-class family and a former, machinist working in a factory. Experience such as these contextualize his own political approach, which he portrays as a return to the original roots of social democracy. So what can he do here? So he's got a lot of work. He's got his work cut out for him as his really kind of unique moment in Australian political history. Austrian political history. First, the far-right FPO is flying high in the polls, which has been leading for months at just under 30%. in of itself is not unusual in Austrian Sanders, yet in view of the coming parliamentary elections, which must be held by the fall of 2024, an FPO chancellorship has never been so likely. The last time the FPO enjoyed similar polling numbers was in the spring of 2017, shortly before the young, polished anti-immigration hardliner Sebastian Kurz took over as chairperson of the historically center-right Austrian People's Party and absorbed a large chunk of the FPO's electorate. However, Kurz is now history, after being forced to resign 2 years ago following a series of corruption scandals. This time around, it's unlikely that another uniquely popular figure is going to step in and save the stagnating OVP before the election. For years, Herbert Kickl has been regarded as the leading ideologue of the FPO. If he were to become Austria's chancellor, the results would be catastrophic for the working class and for the rights of women, migrants, and potentially for Austrian democracy. However, Kickl and the FPO may have met their match in Babler, who addresses precisely the realities fueling the growing resentment toward the political establishment in a pretty authentic and down-to-earth way. And that's probably going to be one of his biggest challenges. If you're comparing him to Jeremy Corbyn, especially, I think one of his limits as a politician is kind of just, he was a very lovable character, obviously, and I've endless respect for Jeremy Corbyn. But, his kind of persona as this kind of London hipster, very intellectual, very theoretical kind of politics, that probably hurt him a little bit when it comes to some of the, working class voters of his country. And if that's not the case for Babler, who, full disclosure, I do not really know anything about, it will be great to see, especially if he can kind of take control of one of Europe's most influential players. So definitely one of the biggest figures, especially as well in the European Union, which Babler has definitely challenged in the past. So that's going to be very interesting to continue to follow. But what will be really interesting is if you go, A, listen to our brand new Hidden History episode going deep on the hidden history of the Korean War. B, leave a voice message about anything related to Newsflash, Hidden History, or anything else at SWRN 702. We will play it on the relevant show. Whether you want to weigh in on what you think about Joe Biden, Donald Trump, or Ron DeSantis, or give us some feedback about the show, SWRN 702 at gmail.com is your way to do it. And then continue to follow, listen to all SWRN content, and join us for Monday's episode. See you then. Have a great weekend.